Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Honors, it is a great honor for me to stand here before you to defend my client, Mr. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi, in a unique case and in a unique and unprecedented procedure which takes place for the first time in the history of the ICC. I say unique because Mr. al-Mahdi pleaded guilty. He acknowledged the charges brought against him. This recognition of guilt, as you are aware, Your Honors, was part of the agreement concluded between the two parties to the case. The agreement contains the details of arrangements reached in relation to this case and the charges brought against Mr. al-Mahdi. As such, Your Honors, my initial submission today will not include any different presentation of what was presented to us by the prosecution. However, we will be presenting an explanation, an interpretation of these events and putting them in a context through which the August Chamber will be able to consider all personal and circumstantial issues surrounding Mr. al-Mahdi's actions when the Chamber should make a decision or a ruling. The events presented to you reflect the truth as was unearthed by the investigations of the Office of the Prosecutor. However, they also reflect the actions of Mr. al-Mahdi in terms of cooperation, submissions, acknowledgement, and the effects of his actions, and presented a true reflection of the charges brought against him. Mr. al-Mahdi, through his testimony, his submissions from the early stages of investigation, provided with conviction, with sincerity, from day one, without any hesitation, without any pressure or threat, provided a true and sincere submission in spite of the difficulties, the risks, and in spite of the obstacles he had to face. Therefore, we would like to ask this august chamber to take all these elements into consideration, and there will be an element related to this aspect that will be dealt with my colleague Maître Gillissen at a later stage. Your Honors, it is of paramount importance that we have the hearings in these few days. In fact, this is a record time for a hearing of this nature, and this did not come out of void. The outcome was a result of a sustained effort by both parties to the case, and first and foremost has to do with the role of Mr. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi. who insisted from the beginning and was steadfast in his position that he should continue to acknowledge his guilt, give testimony, and to cooperate with the court without delay, without trying to bargain a position, because he acknowledged his remorse, acknowledged his regret for his actions, and the fact that he has asked the people of Timbuktu, the people of Mali, and the international community for such forgiveness is very important. Therefore, it is important to look at evidence, at testimonies, as we heard them in the past few days, is the outcome of the seriousness with which Mr. al-Mahdi cooperated with his court and his desire to realize justice, even that justice would be against his own interest. Therefore, Your Honors, this position is an embodiment of how sincere he was and is of acknowledging his guilt. Should be no surprise to those who follow this case, to the public, at the brevity of the duration of this hearing compared to other cases that were dealt with by the ICC. This case was an example of how these hearings can be simplified, whereby agreement can be reached without taking anything out of the difficulties and the complexities of the nature of this case. Therefore, it was very important that we deal with the risks and the threats that could endanger the life of Mr. al-Mahdi, his family, his next of kin. It is also important that we take all these elements on board. We should bear in mind that we need to avoid casting doubt on the sincerity of Mr. al-Mahdi, who was truthful to this court. This is exactly what Mr. al-Mahdi did when he stood before you and told the whole truth. We know that other hearings, other cases went on for longer, much longer periods, not only in this court but in other courts. And we know that in spite of the time taken to deal or to hear these cases, the truth was not reached. And if the truth was reached and justice was not realized, we know that achieving justice and finding the truth is not an easy path that we can take. And that's what Mr. al-Mahdi was aiming to achieve when he spoke openly and frankly and sincerely before you from day one. President, Your Honors, what I would like to put to you today would be an explanation, a clarification of two important elements whereby we can put elements into context and consider a legal framework which would give you a means of assessing the situation and bringing the facts in association with what we want to achieve. The two important elements I made reference to relate. Who is Mr. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi? The second element, what are we talking about? What mausoleums we're talking about and what lies behind the destruction of these mausoleums. The defense is of the view that these two issues are important for the chamber to consider in determining the punishment to be meted out to Mr. al-Mahdi. I think there are elements that relate to the person of Mr. al-Mahdi and the view taken by the public so that Mr. al-Mahdi would not be perceived as an individual completely different to what he is. And we also want to make sure that his intentions would not be interpreted differently without, of course, underestimating what he did or over-exaggerating the magnitude of his acts or actions. It is important that the chamber would understand the personal situation of Mr. al-Mahdi at the time when he made the error, the misjudgment to which he had confessed. Mr. al-Mahdi has the hope that his erroneous actions would be a lesson to all those who would think of committing the same crimes or similar crimes, and that's the reason why he had sought the forgiveness of his country and his community. The first issue I want to deal with relates to Mr. al-Mahdi himself. Contrary to the notion that had found currency in public circles, Mr. al-Mahdi is not a soldier, is not a fighter. He's a civilian from a white Tuareg tribe, lived in Timbuktu for 11 years before armed groups arrived at the city. Mr. al-Mahdi found employment at the Askia Daoud school, a school meant for black Tuareg, and he worked voluntarily for 6 years, from 2001 to 2006. Most of the students enrolled in that school are from the Songhi tribe from Timbuktu, which means that this person, this individual, was well known to this segment of the Timbuktu community. And from 2007 to 2010, he worked as a vice president of the Islamic Youth Association, which included a crème de la crème of Timbuktu. And during that time, Mr. al-Mahdi moved from one mosque to the other to preach to the various sects of Islam upon the request of these mosques, and he did that voluntarily without any remuneration. That is to say that Mr. al-Mahdi was an integral part of the community in Timbuktu without any deference to this sect or the other. At a later stage, he joined the Education Institute, and over a period of 4 years, his record speaks for his ability, for his exemplary behavior. His relationship with the head master of the institute and the other teachers was exemplary also. Equally, Mr. al-Mahdi was a member of the Reconciliation Council, which looked into disputes between the tribes, and he was able to settle several disputes between the Muslim community to show tolerance and to accept each other. He also was one of the founders of the Quranic Education Center, and with other scholars from senior tribes in the Nokondar tribe, a well-known tribe in the region, and this can only show that Mr. Mahdi played a positive role and won the respect of segments of the community. I am using these examples to show what he has contributed to the community. Of course, these are only examples, and there are other examples I can give, but they're too long to cite here. And again, we are looking at a period of 11 years prior to the arrival of the armed groups. The citations I have made shows that Mr. Mahdi was part of the Malian people, part of the Timbuktu community, and was able to accommodate all the different views, sects, ethnicities, and ways of thinking. If we were to look at this history before the arrival of the armed groups, there's clear evidence that Mr. al-Mahdi had no grudges, had no hatred, had no ill feelings towards any members of the community. That's how he lived his life in that community. He was an integral part. He contributed to the social and academic life of Timbuktu. That's the reason why he was well known within the community. He won the trust of the community, and it was one of the reasons why the armed groups tried to lure him into their ranks once they descended on the city. President, Your Honors, it does not make any sense that Mr. al-Mahdi overnight can become the enemy of his own community, someone who wants to destroy that community without external factors, without external elements related to the sequence of events that ensued in 2012, which led him to commit the crime that he was charged with. These circumstances, Mr. President, Your Honors, these influences were numerous, were polarizing, and this leads us to believe that the Al-Qaeda in North Africa had deliberately targeted Mr. al-Mahdi and tried to draw him into their ranks from 2006. They realized how important his role was within the community, how much trust the community had put in him, and the trust his tribe and other tribes have put in him, and the impact it had on large segments of the community. Al-Qaeda was impressed with his knowledge, with his understanding of the Quran, the interpretation of the verses of the Quran. That's why this group started looking into his background, into his financial situation, the family burden that he was shouldering. They presented themselves to him as a local group trying to implement the Sharia and the jurisprudence of Islam, and that's why they call themselves Ansar al-Din. They started lavishing him with presents, a mobile computer, a color printer, boxes of CDs with religious ideas and views. And, Your Honors, they went as far as offering him 40,000 euros as a form of assistance to help him pay off his debts and improve his financial situation. That's how Mr. al-Mahdi voluntarily, without any coercion, joined that group. In view of the circumstances and the influences that I made reference to. Mr. al-Mahdi, out of his own volition, joined that group, and as a result, Ansar al-Din decided to promote him. He was charged with the task of inspecting the military groups from the Tuareg which joined Ansar al-Din. Then he was promoted further by making him head of a Hisbah as a morality enforcement group or force. That's how he found himself in the midst of Ansar al-Din. Mr. President, Your Honors, in this environment and in these circumstances, Mr. al-Mahdi decided to get involved in the process of destroying these mausoleums, and based on the religious interpretation he was led to believe to be right. And this leads me to the issue of the mausoleums and the schools of thought in Islam that dealt with interpretations relating to such mausoleums. And I believe this explanation will help this august chamber to understand the mentality with which Mr. al-Mahdi operated in getting involved in the process of this destruction. This issue is important. It may take us hours to try and to delve into these interpretations. However, I will try to be very brief in shedding more light on the notion of mausoleums in Islamic countries. In some Muslim countries, especially the Muslim countries of the Maghreb, including Mali, Niger, and other countries, the notion of mausoleums stems from the fact that when a human being finds themselves in a position of weakness, financially or morally, and the inability to find solutions to these problems themselves, then they look up to those, the saints or the people who are perceived to be close to God, so that they can help them get out of these difficulties. That's why citizens, Muslims, go to these mausoleums and plead with the saint or with the person believed to be close to God to hope for something. A woman who cannot have children will go to a mausoleum and try to seek solace there or pray through the saint to make God help her have children. And those who face financial difficulties go and plead their case in a mausoleum. That's why Muslims in these countries look up to the preachers, the scholars of Islam, where they have places to visit, and mausoleums or shrines that are built for that purpose will be a destination for these people to go to and seek help. That's how things were with the inception of Islam in Africa, with the introduction of Islam to Africa. And that's why these shrines, these mausoleums became what they became. And that's why Timbuktu became the city of 333 saints over a period of Islamic presence. And if we were to visit North African or Maghreban cities, we will see several shrines, several mausoleums strewn all over the place. That's why the notion of seeking the help of those saints and the plethora of these saints and the mausoleums has become an issue that led to important debate within Islam about whether this allowed or not allowed. And the building of shrines, the building of tombs become an issue to be debated strongly. And there was an attempt to try and interpret the Quran and interpret the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. And this led to the creation of different schools like the Hanafi and what led to the creation most recently of the Wahhabi sect. And each sect, each school of thought interpreted these notions, these principles in a different way. If we were to look at the Maliki sect, which is prominent in North Africa and some sub-Saharan countries like Niger, Mali, the Maliki sect allowed for Sufism to find a place for it, whereby the saints are idolized, they are referred to. On the other hand, diametrically opposed to that is the Wahhabi sect, which is common in Saudi Arabia. This sect prohibited such practices and condemned and went as far as punishing those who adhere to these notions. In the 18th century, in the 13th century, Ibn Taymiyyah was the first to call for the prohibition of Sufism and called for the destruction of all tombs. He went as far as calling for the removal of the tomb of Prophet Muhammad and his daughter. And these views were further strengthened, further elaborated on by Muhammad Abdul Wahab, the spiritual leader of the sect. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab totally forbade people from building tombs.
Ansar-Din, when they came to Timbuktu, considered that they were following the Wahhabi school, which is against all mausoleums, as I have explained. They have considered that building shrines and mausoleums are forbidden by Islamic law and should be dismantled where they exist. And to summarize, and not to be long on you, I will say that Mr. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi was consulted on the topic of destroying the mausoleums in the city of Timbuktu, and he answered. His answer was based on his conviction that from a religious viewpoint we have to destroy them. But I have told you there are different schools of belief. And according to his interpretation and the school of belief he considers appropriate, he said that it is possible to destroy the mausoleums according to the doctrine which forbids building mausoleums on tombs. And despite his conviction of this doctrine, which allows the destruction of mausoleums, he did not accept this idea of destruction, and he refused the destruction. And he answered before the Shura Council of Ansar-Din on that point, and he said that if we destroy them, this may give rise to popular protests and lead to negative effects that are worse than keeping the mausoleums on the tombs. And that was his opinion when he was consulted. But the Emir had a different opinion. He took his decision to destroy. And the members, amongst the leaders, the chief of the Hizbah, Mr. al-Mahdi, had to follow through. And they had to destroy, and as he was the chief of the Hizbah, Mr. al-Mahdi had to organize the destruction. The armed forces were to follow through, and people had to respect the rules of loyalty and follow what the leader had said. So it was done knowingly. We do not want to give excuses, but we want to say that he was well aware of what was done, and he did it in full conscience, and the destruction took place. And he wrote the Preach of Friday, in which he presented the legality of the destruction of the mausoleums. And on many occasions, he presented to the press the legal reasons for the destruction. Your Honor, Your Honors, this is a short summary of the events and the fact and the reality of what Mr. al-Mahdi did and what he went through. Your Honor, Your Honors, Mr. al-Mahdi is standing before you today, admitting honestly and in detail the crime that he is accused of. He expresses strong remorse for the result of his actions. He is asking for your pardon. He is asking for the pardon of the victims, those that have suffered, the children and grandchildren of the saints. He asked for the pardon of the population of Timbuktu, the city of Timbuktu, and the Mali people. He is asking for pardon from humanity as a whole. And he is asking from all Muslims in the world pardon, and he gives them this following advice: do not undertake such actions that will be extremely grave and that cannot be corrected. And he has collaborated with the court and is ready to pursue his collaboration with the court in order to allow justice to arise. And he wants to participate in creating the reconciliation and peace in his country, Mali. And he lastly asks you to be clement, lenient, and make proof of mercy when you take your decision. Thank you. And my colleague, Mr. Jean-Louis Gélissen, will now take the floor for the second part of our pleadings. Thank you, sir.